Why would you build a calendar of stone to map the unblinking eyes of the stars when your world was not running out of time but drowning in water? How does a paradise, a sprawling green Eden teeming with life, become a hyper-arid tomb of ochre sand, not over millennia but within the span of a single human life? This isn't a riddle. It is the epitaph of the first great society on Earth, a civilization that rose from the waters of a forgotten Sahara and was consumed by the fire of a relentless sun. Their story begins not with kings or empires, but with a question of survival, whispered on the shores of vast freshwater lakes, lakes that glittered where today there is only the Great Sand Sea. Before Egypt, before the first pyramid was ever conceived, this was the center of the human world, a world of green. For 6,000 years, the Sahara was a verdant savanna, a sprawling network of rivers, lakes, and wetlands. It was a hunter's dream, filled with giraffe, elephant, and hippopotamus. Human tribes followed the herds, their lives dictated by the rhythm of the monsoon rains, a benevolent cycle of flood and plenty. They were a people of the water, building communities along the shorelines of now-vanished megalakes. But even in paradise there is competition. The best hunting grounds, the most reliable watering holes, these were prizes to be fought for. Archaeological evidence points to ritualized conflict, battles not for annihilation, but for dominance, for the right to prosper. Yet their greatest enemy wasn't the tribe across the lake, it was the sky itself. The monsoons, the very source of their world's vitality, were fickle. A slight deviation in the planetary wobble, a subtle shift in ocean currents, and the life-giving rains could weaken or fail entirely. For a generation, the land would parch, herds would thin, children would starve. Desperation is the true mother of invention. It was in this crucible of climatic anxiety that humanity took its first giant leap. Somewhere in the southern reaches of what is now Egypt, at a place we call Nubia, these cattle-herding people did something extraordinary. They began to build. They dragged monolithic stones, some weighing several tons, across the savannah. They aligned them with meticulous care, not to build a fortress or a palace, but to create a clock, a cosmic clock. The stone circles of Nubia predate Stonehenge by more than 1,000 years. They mark the summer solstice, the point in the year when the rains should return. They align with the belt of Orion, a constellation that held deep meaning for later Nile civilizations. This was not abstract astronomy. This was a tool for survival, a desperate, brilliant attempt to impose order on a chaotic world, to read the intentions of the gods written in the stars. They were trying to predict the future, to know when the rains would come and when they would fail. A priestly class likely emerged, the keepers of this celestial knowledge, the ones who could interpret the movements of the sun and stars, and perhaps, they believed, even influence them through ritual. They built burial mounds for their revered cattle, cementing the bond between their society and the animals that sustained them. They created a complex, organized culture, the first of its kind, born from the fear of a silent, empty sky. What would you feel standing among those ancient, silent stones, knowing they were erected not out of faith in the gods, but out of a profound lack of it? Knowing they were a shield against the terrifying randomness of nature? For a time, their system worked. Their society flourished, growing more complex, more stable. They were the star shepherds of the Green Sahara. They built their world on a delicate balance, a covenant between humanity and the climate. They believed they had deciphered the eternal laws of the cosmos. But the cosmos does not negotiate. Around 6,200 years before Common Era, something in the planetary engine broke. The African monsoon system didn't just weaken, it collapsed. It was an impossibly fast catastrophe. Within 2 or 3 generations, the rains stopped, not for a season, but forever. The lakes began to shrink, turning saline and then disappearing entirely, leaving behind vast, cracked plains of mud. The rivers dried to dusty ribbons. The lush grasslands withered, turning yellow, then brown, then to dust. The great herds vanished, migrating away or dying in place. Paradise became a furnace. The attempts to hold back the apocalypse must have been frantic. The rituals at the stone circles would have grown more desperate, the sacrifices more profound. But the stars offered no relief. The sun only grew hotter. The wind began to carry a new sound, the whisper of moving sand. An empire can be rebuilt after a war. A city can be fortified against an army. But there is no weapon against the death of a planet. They had built a society on the promise of water, and the promise was broken. Their world was ending, not with a bang, but with the silent, relentless advance of 1 trillion grains of sand. They looked to the heavens for answers, only to find that the earth beneath their feet had already passed its judgment. Their only choice was exodus. A great scattering of peoples began, a panicked flight from the heart of the dying Sahara. They fled in all directions, but the most desperate, and perhaps the most organized, traveled east. They were searching for water, for a new lifeline in a world turned to hell. They were following a folk memory, a rumor of a great river that never ran dry. These were not primitive nomads wandering aimlessly. They were the survivors of a sophisticated, shattered civilization. They carried with them not just their meager belongings, but their ideas. They carried the memory of social order, of monumental construction, of a leadership legitimized by cosmic knowledge. They carried the deeply ingrained belief that survival depended on controlling and predicting the forces of nature. They were a people scarred by chaos, and they were searching for a place where they could reimpose order. They found it along the fertile, predictable banks of the Nile. The arrival of these climate refugees from the West was the catalyst that would ignite the next chapter of human history. They brought their trauma, their ambition, and their gods to the doorstep of Egypt. The forgotten world of the Green Sahara died, but its ghost would haunt the next great civilization to rise, shaping its destiny in ways the pharaohs themselves would never fully understand. Their legacy was a warning that even the most eternal paradise can be lost, and that the greatest enemy is not another tribe, but the world itself. The great exodus from the dying Sahara was not a single event, but a cascade of human movement that lasted for centuries. These refugees, carrying the intellectual seeds of their lost world, funneled into the narrow, fertile corridor of the Nile Valley. The valley was already inhabited, home to scattered farming and herding communities. But the newcomers were different. They were driven by a collective trauma, a deep-seated need for stability in a world that had proven terrifyingly unstable. They understood that the key to survival was not just finding water, but controlling it. They brought with them the concept of a society organized on a grand scale, a society capable of monumental undertakings, a society led by those who could claim a special connection to the cosmic order. The world they left behind was one of horizontal immensity. The world they found was one of vertical power, defined by the singular, life-giving artery of the river. And along this river, the first battle for civilization was about to begin. It would not be fought in Egypt. It would be fought to the south, in the land of Nubia. The refugees from the west met and mingled with the indigenous peoples of the northern Sudan, and from this fusion, a new power began to coalesce. This was the kingdom of Tarseti, the land of the bow, so named by later Egyptians for the legendary skill of its archers. Long before the first pharaoh unified the lands of Upper and Lower Egypt, the kings of Tarseti were establishing the very template of pharaonic rule. At a site called Kustul, archaeologists unearthed a cemetery of astonishing wealth and significance. The tombs, dating to around 3,300 before Common Era, contained artifacts that would later become the classic symbols of Egyptian kingship. Gold jewelry, pottery of exquisite craftsmanship, and hundreds of sacrificed retainers meant to serve their master in the afterlife. But one object stood above all others. A stone incense burner carved with a procession of sacred boats culminating in the image of a seated ruler. He wears not a simple cap, but a tall, conical headdress. It is the white crown, the hedjet, the supreme symbol of rule over the southern lands. This was not found in Egypt. This was found in Nubia, centuries before the first Egyptian king, Narmer, was ever depicted wearing it on his famous palette. The implications are staggering. The very iconography of power, the divine right to rule, that would define Egypt for 3,000 years, appears to have originated here, in a Nubian kingdom that history chose to forget. The Scorpion kings of Nekhen and Thinis, the northern chieftains who were simultaneously forging their own proto-kingdoms, were not inventing a new model of kingship. They were competing with, and likely imitating, an older, more established power to the south. Tarseti was no primitive backwater. It was a sophisticated, organized state whose wealth was built on the control of trade. They commanded the southern gateway to Africa, the source of gold, ebony, incense, and ivory that the growing populations to the north craved. Their capital, which may lie beneath the modern city of Aswan, was a bustling hub of commerce and power. They were the first middlemen, the first masters of the Nile. In the valley of the Nile, a crown is not inherited. It is taken, paid for in blood, and gilded with the memory of a defeated king. This prosperity inevitably led to conflict. The relationship between Tarseti and the northern proto-kingdoms was a complex dance of trade and warfare. For generations they were rivals, each seeking to dominate the river and its resources. Border skirmishes would have been common: raids on caravans, clashes over grazing rights, battles for control of strategic trading posts. These were not yet clashes of great empires, but a relentless, low-grade war of attrition between ambitious royal houses. The kings of Tarseti, with their archers and their control of southern wealth, were a formidable force. But the north had a demographic advantage. The floodplain of Upper Egypt could support a larger population, and over time, the chieftains of Nekhen and Thinis were able to consolidate their power, forming larger, more cohesive armies. They learned from their southern neighbors, adopting their symbols of power, their rituals of kingship, and their ambition for a unified control of the entire river. The final confrontation was inevitable. The historical record is sparse, written by the eventual victors, the Egyptians, who had little interest in glorifying a defeated enemy. But the archaeological evidence tells a clear story. Around 3100 before Common Era, the tombs of Kustul fall silent. The wealth of Tarseti vanishes from the record. At the same time, the imagery of Egyptian kings like Narmer explodes with scenes of conquest, depicting the smiting of southern enemies. It seems clear that the rising power of Upper Egypt launched a final, decisive campaign to eliminate its southern rival once and for all. They didn't just defeat Tarseti, they seem to have systematically erased it, absorbing its territory, co-opting its symbols, and writing it out of history. The first kingdom of the Nile fell, its memory buried under the foundations of its successor. Egypt was born from this victory. The unification of the two lands, the iconic moment that begins the dynastic period, was not simply an internal affair. It was the culmination of a long and brutal struggle for supremacy, a struggle in which the first true kings, the Nubian rulers of Tarseti, were the ultimate losers. Their culture was suppressed, their power broken. But the memory of a southern kingdom, a Nubian power, did not die. It smoldered for centuries, a seed of resentment planted deep in the heart of the conquered lands, waiting for Egypt to turn its gaze away, waiting to be reborn from the ashes of Tarseti into something far larger and far more dangerous. For centuries after the conquest of Tarseti, Nubia remained under the shadow of its northern neighbor. Egypt's old kingdom pharaohs treated it as a colonial territory, a resource depot to be plundered for gold, stone, and slaves. They launched punitive raids, built rudimentary forts, and carved inscriptions boasting of their domination over the wretched Kush. But they never fully tamed it. Beyond the reach of their armies, in the fertile lands of the Dongola Reach, the descendants of Tarseti and other Nubian peoples were regrouping. They were watching, they were learning, and they were building. As Egypt's old kingdom crumbled into the chaos of the first intermediate period, its grip on the south weakened. This was the opportunity the Nubians had been waiting for. From the heartland of Kush, a new power arose, one that would not just rival Egypt, but challenge its very existence. This was the Kingdom of Kerma. It grew from a small agricultural town into a sprawling, fortified metropolis, the capital of a vast and wealthy empire that stretched for hundreds of miles along the Nile. At the heart of the city stood a structure unlike anything else in the ancient world, the Western Defufa. It was not a pyramid or a stone temple, but a colossal monument of mud brick, rising nearly 20 meters high, its solid mass dominating the landscape for miles. It was a statement of power, a symbol of a uniquely Nubian faith and royal authority. Surrounding it was a city of palaces, workshops, and houses, all protected by massive defensive walls with imposing bastions. This was no mere trading post, it was the center of a military and economic powerhouse. The wealth of Kerma, like that of its predecessor, was built on trade and resources. Its kings controlled the gold mines of the eastern desert and the trade routes that brought exotic goods from the heart of Africa. But they added a new and deadly element to their arsenal: industry. Kerma became a center for metallurgy. Its workshops produced bronze goods of exceptional quality, particularly daggers with beautiful ivory hilts, which were prized as far away as the Mediterranean. And they perfected the art of war. The archers of Kerma were the most feared warriors of their age, their skill with the bow becoming legendary throughout the Nile Valley. The pharaohs of Egypt's reunified Middle Kingdom watched the rise of this new southern power with growing alarm. This was not the fractured land of tribes their ancestors had dominated. This was an organized, militarized state with imperial ambitions of its own. Inscriptions from the period are filled with a new kind of respect, a grudging acknowledgement of Kerma as a serious threat. Pharaoh Senusret III described the Nubians not as pathetic subjects, but as aggressive warriors who, if attacked, would fight back fiercely. He understood that simple raids would no longer suffice. In response, Egypt embarked on one of the most ambitious military construction projects in history. They built a chain of enormous fortresses along the Second Cataract, the border between their territories. Forts like Buin and Semna were marvels of military engineering, with massive walls, dry moats, and interlocking fields of fire for archers. They were designed for one purpose: to hold back the tide of Kushite power. Empires build walls to keep threats out. But sometimes the walls only serve to show their enemies precisely where to strike. For over a century, a tense Cold War existed between the two empires. The Egyptian forts controlled the river, but the armies of Kerma dominated the desert, launching swift raids on Egyptian patrols and supply lines. It was a stalemate, a contest of wills between two superpowers locked in a struggle for the soul of the Nile. The breaking point came when Egypt once again fell into disarray. Around 1650 before Common Era, foreign invaders known as the Hyksos conquered the Nile Delta, shattering the unity of the Middle Kingdom. The king of Kerma saw his chance. He formed an audacious alliance with the Hyksos, creating a pincer movement to crush the native Egyptian rulers trapped in the middle at Thebes. In a stunning reversal of history, the armies of Kerma surged north, bypassing or capturing the great fortresses. They sacked Egyptian towns, plundered temples, and for a brief, glorious period, the Black Pharaohs of Kerma ruled over a significant portion of Upper Egypt. An ancient letter intercepted by the Egyptians reveals the breathtaking scope of their alliance. The Kushite king proposes to the Hyksos ruler that they divide Egypt between them, destroying their common enemy. This was Kerma's zenith, the moment it stood as the most powerful state in the Nile Valley. But its triumph was short-lived. The sheer audacity of the Kerma-Hyksos alliance sparked a furious nationalist backlash among the Theban Egyptians. Led by a series of warrior pharaohs, they launched a war of liberation, first driving out the Hyksos and then turning their vengeful gaze southward. The war that followed was one of annihilation. The pharaohs of the newly established New Kingdom were determined not just to defeat Kerma, but to obliterate it. They stormed the southern capital, burning the city and slaughtering its inhabitants. They pulled down the Defufa and built Egyptian temples on its ruins. They systematically destroyed every vestige of Kushite independence, annexing Nubia and ruling it with an iron fist for the next 400 years. The great empire of Kerma was extinguished, its people enslaved, its culture suppressed. Egypt had won the long war for the Nile, but the victory came at a cost. It had been forced to become a militaristic, imperialistic state to defeat its southern rival. The ghost of Kerma would shape the character of the new kingdom, a constant reminder that its power was not absolute, that from the south, a rival could always rise again. The bronze daggers of Kerma were traded far and wide, their influence reaching beyond the Nile, westward into the vast, drying expanse of the Sahara. There, caravans followed ancient pathways, seeking not gold or glory, but a commodity more precious than both: salt. And where the salt routes crossed, cities of stone were rising. While the empires of Egypt and Kerma waged their bloody contest for the Nile, a completely different kind of civilization was taking root hundreds of miles to the west, in the harsh landscape of what is now southern Mauritania. Here, on the edge of the expanding Sahara, there was no great river to nurture cities, no gold mines to fuel royal ambition. There was only rock, sparse grassland, and the relentless sun. Yet, in this improbable setting, the people of the Tichit Walata tradition achieved something remarkable. They became the first city builders in West Africa, creating a dense network of urban settlements long before Carthage or Rome were even founded. Over a period of 1,000 years, beginning around 2500 before Common Era, these agro-pastoralists constructed more than 400 stone settlements, nestled along the dramatic escarpments of the Dar Tichit and Dar Walata cliffs. These were not mere hamlets. The largest, like Dar Tichit itself, were sprawling metropolises with clearly defined streets, public squares, and complex residential compounds, all enclosed by massive defensive walls. Their architecture was a testament to their ingenuity and their environment. They built with what they had: dry stone masonry, skillfully crafting sturdy, lasting structures without a single drop of mortar or a single nail. The compounds were often circular, with smaller enclosures for livestock branching off from a central courtyard. It was a design born of their pastoralist roots, a way to bring their precious herds of cattle and goats within the safety of the city walls at night. This was an urban civilization on a grand scale, likely housing tens of thousands of people at its peak. Their wealth was not derived from conquest or plunder, but from their mastery of the land and their control of trade. They were expert cattle herders, and they cultivated hardy grains like millet, storing the surplus in stone granaries. But their true economic leverage came from their position astride the nascent trans-Saharan trade routes. They controlled access to crucial resources, particularly the valuable salt deposits of the desert interior. In a world without refrigeration, salt was a strategic commodity, essential for preserving food. The people of Tichit Walata were the gatekeepers of this white gold. Yet, what is most fascinating about this civilization is what it lacked. There is no evidence of a powerful, centralized state or a divine kingship like that found on the Nile. There are no grand royal tombs, no monumental temples dedicated to a single ruler. Power seems to have been decentralized, perhaps organized around extended family clans, each controlling a particular settlement. Their society appears more egalitarian, built on cooperation as much as on command. Their greatest struggle was not against a neighboring army, but against the slow, inexorable enemy of climate change. They rose during a period of increasing aridity, a time when the Sahara was aggressively expanding southward. Their stone walls were likely built not only to defend against human raiders, but to protect their communities and pastures from the encroaching sands. Their lives were a constant, desperate battle for water. They built small dams and retaining walls to capture precious rainfall, but year by year the climate grew hotter and drier. The grasslands that supported their herds began to shrink. The springs that fed their wells began to fail. An army can be fought, a king can be overthrown, but no sword can stop the patient march of a single grain of sand. The decline of the Tichit Walata civilization was a slow-motion catastrophe, a drama played out over centuries. Unlike Kerma, which was destroyed in a climactic war, this culture seems to have simply faded away. There are no signs of widespread destruction or conquest. Instead, the settlements appear to have been abandoned gradually, one by one, as life became unsustainable. As the desert advanced, the people retreated. It was a mass migration in increments, a slow, reluctant surrender to an enemy they could not defeat. Where did they go? The mystery of their disappearance is part of their haunting legacy. Most scholars believe they moved south into the more humid regions of the Sahel and West Africa, taking their skills as masons, their knowledge of social organization, and their traditions with them. They may have been the ancestors of later kingdoms like the Ghana Empire, their urban experiment providing the foundational blueprint for future civilizations. Their stone cities were slowly swallowed by the Sahara, their streets filled with sand, their walls crumbling under the silent press of time. For thousands of years, their existence was forgotten, their story known only to the desert winds. It was only in the 20th century that archaeologists, using aerial photography, rediscovered the ghostly outlines of these lost cities in the sand. They stand as a powerful, silent monument to a different path of civilization, one built not on divine kings and monumental egos, but on communal effort and a fierce, ultimately doomed, struggle against a changing planet. What would you do if your world was slowly dying around you? Would you stay and fight for every last drop of water, a testament to human endurance? Or would you leave in search of a new home, a testament to human adaptability? Let us know what you would choose in the comments below. The people of Tichit Walata vanished, perhaps pushed south and east by the desert, their trade routes dissolving like mirages. But other routes, far more daring, were being forged not across sand, but across the treacherous waters of the Red Sea, in search of a land the gods themselves were said to frequent, the land of Punt. The pharaohs of Egypt, secure in their unified kingdom, craved more than just power and territory. They craved immortality, and immortality had a price. The gods did not accept gold or grain as payment. They demanded a very specific tribute. They required the fragrant smoke of myrrh and frankincense to rise from the altars of their temples. These sacred resins, along with other exotic treasures like ivory, ebony, and strange animals, came from a mysterious, semi-mythical place known as Punt, the land of the god. For centuries, Punt was Egypt's elusive and most vital trading partner. It was not a place to be conquered, but a destination to be reached, a perilous journey to the very edge of the known world. Organizing an expedition to Punt was the ancient equivalent of a space mission. It was a massive undertaking requiring immense resources, cutting-edge technology, and incredible bravery. First, ships had to be constructed not for the placid waters of the Nile, but for the open, stormy expanse of the Red Sea. These vessels were then disassembled, hauled overland across the eastern desert by thousands of men, and reassembled at a port on the coast. The journey itself was fraught with danger. The Red Sea was notorious for its unpredictable storms and treacherous reefs. But the greatest threat came from other people. The sea lanes were prowled by pirates, opportunistic raiders who preyed on the wealthy Egyptian cargo ships. The coastal lands were inhabited by tribes who were not always welcoming. A mission to Punt was as much a military operation as a commercial one, with soldiers accompanying the sailors and merchants to protect the priceless cargo. One of the most famous of these expeditions was launched by the female pharaoh Hatshepsut around 1470 before Common Era. The stunning reliefs in her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri chronicle the entire mission in vivid detail. We see the fleet of 5 great ships setting sail, their arrival in the strange land of Punt, and their interactions with its people. The depiction of Punt is fascinating. It is shown as a land of dome-shaped houses built on stilts over the water, a world of exotic palm and myrrh trees. The people of Punt, led by their king Pharaoh and his remarkably obese Queen Ati, are shown as sophisticated trading partners, not as primitive subjects. They greet the Egyptians with respect, engaging in peaceful and prosperous trade. The location of Punt remains one of history's great unsolved mysteries. The goods it produced and the images from Hatshepsut's temple suggest a location in the southern Red Sea region, possibly on the coast of modern-day Eritrea, Somalia, or even across the water in Yemen. It was likely not a single, unified kingdom, but a network of coastal city-states and inland confederations that controlled the flow of goods from the African and Arabian interiors. The Egyptians traded manufactured goods, tools, weapons, jewelry for the raw materials of Punt. The reliefs show them loading their ships with piles of fragrant myrrh resin, with live myrrh trees to be planted in the gardens of Egyptian temples, with ebony logs, chests of gold, ivory tusks, and exotic animals like baboons and leopards. To the pharaohs, Punt was not a place on a map. It was a fragrance in a temple, a promise of eternal life that could be bought if your ships were strong enough. The return journey was just as perilous, the ships now laden with a fortune that made them an even more tempting target for pirates. The successful return of an expedition from Punt was a cause for national celebration. The treasures were dedicated to the god Amun-Ra, reinforcing the pharaoh's divine right to rule. The stories told by the returning sailors would have filled the popular imagination with tales of adventure, of strange lands and wondrous beasts. The quest for Punt was more than just economics. It was a core part of Egypt's geopolitical strategy and its religious identity. It was about securing the supply chain of salvation. It was about projecting power to the furthest corners of the earth. But this trade was a two-way street. It brought African and Arabian goods and influence into Egypt, just as it brought Egyptian culture south. The Red Sea was a great highway of exchange, a melting pot of cultures and ideas. While the Egyptians saw Punt as a source of divine treasures, the people of Punt undoubtedly saw the powerful kingdom to the north as a rich, if sometimes arrogant, customer. The hunt for Punt was a grand adventure, a testament to the courage of ancient mariners and the ambition of pharaohs. The treasures of Punt fueled the divine machinery of Egypt, but true power on the continent was being forged elsewhere. Not from gold or incense, but from the very earth itself. In the humid forests of West Africa, far from the sea and the desert, artisans were shaping clay into haunting faces, and in secret their smiths were performing a new kind of magic, turning black rock into a metal that would change the world. In the heart of what is now central Nigeria, on a plateau where the savannah meets the forest, a remarkable culture emerged around 1500 before Common Era. We do not know what they called themselves. We know them only by the name of the small village where their most famous artifacts were first discovered, Nok. For decades, the Nok were known for one thing, their extraordinary terracotta sculptures. These life-sized and miniature heads and figures are among the most expressive and artistically sophisticated works of art from ancient Africa. With their triangular eyes, parted lips, and elaborate hairstyles, they are hauntingly beautiful, capturing a sense of individual personality and spiritual intensity. They are a window into the soul of a people we know almost nothing about. For a long time, this was the entire story of the Nok. They were a mysterious society of brilliant artists who appeared, flourished for over 1,000 years, and then vanished. But in recent decades, a new discovery has transformed our understanding of their importance. Beneath the same soil that yielded the terracotta heads, archaeologists found something else: the remains of sophisticated iron smelting furnaces. Radiocarbon dating revealed a startling fact. The Nok people were making iron as early as 500 before Common Era, if not earlier. This places them among the very first societies in sub-Saharan Africa to master the complex technology of metallurgy. And crucially, there is no evidence that they learned this skill from outsiders. Unlike in the Nile Valley, where the technology was likely imported from the Near East, the iron revolution of the Nok appears to be a homegrown innovation. This was a technological leap as significant as the invention of the internet. Before iron, agriculture in the dense forests of West Africa was a monumental struggle. Stone and wooden tools were simply not effective at clearing the thick vegetation, but an iron axe could fell a tree in a fraction of the time. An iron hoe could break up hard soil with ease. Suddenly, vast new territories could be opened up for farming, leading to a population explosion. Iron didn't just change agriculture, it revolutionized warfare. An army equipped with iron-tipped spears and swords had an almost insurmountable advantage over one using weapons of stone, bone, and wood. Iron created a new and terrifying disparity in military power. The Nok culture itself seems to have been a relatively peaceful, settled society of farmers and artists, but the technology they unleashed was a disruptive force, a genie let out of the bottle that could never be put back. The knowledge of iron smelting did not stay contained on the Nok Plateau. It spread like wildfire. Blacksmiths became some of the most powerful and secretive members of society, their ability to transform rock into metal seen as a form of potent magic. New groups acquired the technology and used their newfound military might to expand, to conquer, to migrate. They shaped clay in the image of their ancestors, but they shaped iron in the image of their future, a future of conquest and creation. This technological diffusion is believed to be the engine that drove one of the most significant demographic events in human history, the Bantu expansion. Beginning in the region near the Nok heartland, iron-equipped, Bantu-speaking peoples began a centuries-long migration that would eventually carry them across the entire southern half of the African continent, from the Congo rainforest to the coasts of the Indian Ocean and the plains of South Africa. They brought their language, their farming techniques, and their iron tools with them, transforming the cultural and genetic landscape of the continent forever. The Nok culture itself, the originator of this revolution, eventually faded. Around the 1st century of the Common Era, their distinctive art style disappears from the archaeological record. We don't know why. It could have been due to climate change, internal conflict, or simply absorption into the new, more dynamic societies that their own technology had helped to create. They were the brilliant, forgotten spark that lit a continental fire. Their terracotta heads are the silent witnesses to a pivotal moment in history, a time when a technological breakthrough gave humanity a new and powerful tool for both creation and destruction. The Nok proved that a revolution doesn't always begin with an army or a king. Sometimes it begins in the heat of a furnace, in the hands of a smith who has discovered a new and terrible secret. The Iron Revolution armed new peoples and shattered old balances of power, sending ripples of change across the continent. These waves of migration and conflict eventually reached the strategic highlands of the Horn of Africa, where a new power was rising, built on a resource as vital as iron and as fragrant as the myrrh of Punt, the sacred resins of the incense trade. At the crossroads of Africa and Arabia, where the high, rugged plateau of Ethiopia meets the Red Sea, a new civilization rose to prominence in the first millennium before Common Era. This was the Kingdom of DMT, a powerful and sophisticated state that harnessed both the agricultural wealth of the highlands and the commercial wealth of the ancient trade routes. Its story is a complex tapestry of indigenous African development interwoven with influences from its powerful neighbors across the sea, the Sabaean kingdom of modern-day Yemen, the legendary land of the Queen of Sheba. The power of Diemt was rooted in the land itself. The Ethiopian highlands offered fertile soil, reliable rainfall, and a defensible mountainous terrain. The people of Diemt became masters of their environment, constructing impressive dams and irrigation systems to maximize their agricultural output. This surplus of food supported a growing population, specialized craftsmen, and a powerful ruling class. But their true geopolitical significance came from their control of the incense route. The highlands were one of the world's primary sources of frankincense and myrrh, resins that were worth more than their weight in gold in the ancient world. They were the oil of their day, essential for religious ceremonies from the temples of Egypt to the shrines of Mesopotamia. Control of this lucrative trade brought Diemt into close contact with the Sabaeans. For a long time, scholars believed Diemt was merely a colony of Sheba, an outpost of an Arabian empire. But modern archaeology has revealed a more complex picture. Diemt was a distinctly African kingdom that engaged in a deep and symbiotic relationship with its Arabian neighbors. Sabaean merchants, masons, and scribes likely settled in the Diemt capital, which may have been at Yeha, where a magnificent, beautifully preserved stone temple still stands. They brought with them their architectural styles, their religious pantheon centered on the moon god Almaka, and their script, which became the basis for the later Ge'ez alphabet of Ethiopia. This was not a colonial relationship, but a partnership, albeit one likely marked by intense rivalry. Dimt and Sheba were competitors as much as they were partners, each vying for the dominant share of the incense trade. They were the ancient equivalent of two modern superpowers competing for control of a vital energy resource. This struggle played out through diplomacy, economic competition, and likely open warfare. Caravans laden with incense had to be protected from rival raiding parties and hostile desert tribes. Ports had to be secured. Alliances had to be forged and broken. The society of DMT was a cosmopolitan melting pot. Its art and architecture show a unique fusion of African and Sabaean styles. Its rulers presided over a complex state with a bureaucracy to manage trade and a priesthood to manage the state religion. They built palaces and temples, and their influence extended over a wide territory. Gods and kings have one thing in common: both demand their tribute in fragrant smoke. But like many ancient kingdoms, Damt's power was precarious. It faced internal pressures from rival factions and external threats from other groups seeking to muscle in on the incense trade. After several centuries of prosperity, the kingdom began to decline around the 4th century before Common Era. The centralized state appears to have fragmented into a collection of smaller successor kingdoms. The reasons for this collapse are not entirely clear. It could have been caused by a shift in trade routes, internal power struggles, or environmental degradation. What is clear is that DMT did not simply vanish. It laid the cultural, political, and technological foundation for the next great power to arise in the Ethiopian highlands, the mighty Aksumite Empire, which would come to dominate the Red Sea trade and become one of the great powers of the late antique world. Dimt's story is a reminder that civilizations are not born in isolation. They rise at the intersection of cultures, at the crossroads of trade, in the crucible of competition. The battle for the incense roots created and destroyed kingdoms in the fertile highlands. But in the heart of the Sahara, a place long given up for dead, a civilization was achieving the impossible. They had no great river, no monsoon rains. Instead, they tapped a hidden ocean, a fossil sea beneath the sand, and on its ghost waters they built an empire of chariots and raiders. By the middle of the first millennium before Common Era, the Sahara had become the hyper-arid desert we know today. It was a vast, seemingly lifeless void, an impassable barrier that separated the Mediterranean world from the lands of sub-Saharan Africa. Or so it seemed. In the heart of this wasteland, in the mountainous Fezzan region of modern-day Libya, a remarkable people not only survived but thrived. They were the Garamantes, and they performed a miracle of engineering that allowed them to build a flourishing urban civilization in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. Their secret lay beneath the sand. The Garamantes discovered that deep underground lay a vast reservoir of fossil water, a massive aquifer left over from the Sahara's wet phase thousands of years earlier. This water was a finite resource, a non-renewable inheritance from a lost world. To get to it, they engineered and constructed an incredible irrigation system known as fogaras. It was a network of thousands of kilometers of slightly sloping underground tunnels. These tunnels tapped into the aquifer deep within the mountains and used gravity to channel the water for tens of kilometers to their settlements and fields in the lowlands. It was a monumental undertaking requiring a deep understanding of geology and hydraulics. Tens of thousands of vertical shafts had to be dug to provide ventilation and access for maintenance. It was grueling, dangerous work, all done by hand. This system transformed the desert. It allowed the Garamantes to create a string of lush oases, turning barren sand into fertile farmland. They grew dates, grapes, wheat, and barley, supporting a large and concentrated population. Their capital, Garama, became a bustling city of over 4,000 inhabitants, with another 6,000 living in surrounding villages. It was a true desert metropolis, a testament to the power of human ingenuity. But the Garamantes were not just brilliant farmers and engineers, they were formidable warriors. The Greek historian Herodotus wrote of them as a very great nation, who used four-horse chariots to hunt the Ethiopian troglodytes, or cave dwellers, of the deep desert. For centuries, they were the undisputed masters of the Sahara. They controlled the crucial trans-Saharan trade routes, growing rich by taxing the caravans that carried gold, ivory, and slaves from the south to the Roman cities on the Mediterranean coast. Their mastery of the desert and their use of swift war chariots made them a terrifying military force. They launched daring, long-range raids across the sands, striking deep into Roman territory. They plundered coastal cities, took slaves, and vanished back into the desert before the slow-moving Roman legions could ever hope to respond. Rome, the superpower of the age, was vexed by this desert kingdom. The Garamantes were a persistent thorn in the side of their African provinces. The Romans mounted several punitive expeditions to try and subdue them, but it was a futile effort. The legions were trained for conventional warfare, not for the guerrilla tactics and vast, waterless expanses of the Sahara. The desert was the Garamantes' greatest weapon. It swallowed Roman armies whole. For a time, the Garamantes enjoyed a golden age. They were a wealthy, powerful, and independent kingdom that defied the might of Rome. They built temples and elaborate tombs and developed a unique written script. They were a triumph of human will over a hostile environment. But their civilization was built on borrowed time. Their entire existence depended on a single, finite resource, the fossil water in their ancient aquifer. They were draining it far faster than it could ever be replenished. They drank from the well of yesterday to build the cities of today, forgetting that tomorrow would surely come and it would be thirsty. The end came not with a bang, but with a slow, agonizing whimper. Sometime around the 4th century of the Common Era, the fogaras began to run dry. The flow of water lessened, the fields began to wither, and the desert began to reclaim the oases they had so painstakingly created. Their population declined, their power waned, and their cities were gradually abandoned. Their empire crumbled, not because of Roman legions, but because they had exhausted the very resource that gave them life. The Garamantes are a profound and unsettling cautionary tale. They were a brilliant, innovative civilization that engineered a paradise in the desert, only to discover that the laws of nature are absolute. Their story demonstrates that even the most advanced technology is no match for unsustainable resource consumption. They built a spectacular, fleeting empire on borrowed water. Their fall was a lesson in resource management, a lesson humanity has been failing to learn for millennia. And to find the very first chapter of that lesson, we must travel deeper in time, to an age before kingdoms, before iron, before even the potter's wheel. We travel to the Great Rift Valley, where the first currency of power was not water or gold, but a glittering black stone born of volcanic fire, obsidian. Before humanity learned to shape metal, the sharpest edge in the world was made of glass. Obsidian, a volcanic glass, formed by the rapid cooling of lava, can be fractured to produce a cutting edge hundreds of times sharper than a modern surgical scalpel. For our Stone Age ancestors, this black, glittering material was the ultimate high technology. A well-crafted obsidian blade could butcher an animal, carve wood, or serve as a devastatingly effective weapon. It was the difference between life and death, between starvation and survival. But obsidian was rare. It could only be found in specific volcanic regions, places where the Earth's fiery heart bled onto its surface. One of the richest sources on the planet was, and still is, the Great Rift Valley of East Africa, the very cradle of humankind. This scarcity created the world's first strategic resource. Long before kings fought over gold and empires clashed over oil, ancient hunter-gatherers waged a silent, centuries-long struggle for control of this precious volcanic stone. Archaeologists have developed methods to trace any piece of obsidian back to its precise volcanic source, analyzing its unique chemical signature like a fingerprint. When they apply this technique to the thousands of obsidian tools found at prehistoric sites across East Africa, a stunning picture emerges. They can map vast, ancient trade networks, intricate webs of exchange that stretched for hundreds, sometimes thousands of kilometers. An obsidian blade found in a rock shelter in Kenya might have originated from a volcano 400 kilometers away in Ethiopia. This was the dawn of the global economy, born not in a city marketplace but around a campfire, in the exchange of a perfectly crafted stone blade. This was not always peaceful trade. The groups that lived near the obsidian quarries held immense power. They were the gatekeepers, the controllers of the supply. They were, in effect, the obsidian kings of the Stone Age. They could choose who to trade with, who to deny, and how much to charge. Control over these quarries would have been fiercely contested. We can imagine raids and ambushes, tribal wars fought not for territory or glory, but for access to the raw material of survival. Protecting the caravans that transported the valuable stone over long distances would have been a dangerous business. These were not casual journeys. They were organized expeditions into hostile territory, fraught with risk. The men and women who undertook these treks were the pioneers of long-distance commerce, their actions governed by the timeless principles of supply and demand, risk and reward. These exchange networks did more than just move stone around. They moved ideas, genes, and information. They were the social glue that connected disparate groups of people, fostering alliances and sparking conflicts. The possession of high-quality obsidian, or finely made tools from a distant source, became a status symbol. It marked an individual or a group as being well-connected, powerful, and influential. It was the prehistoric equivalent of owning a luxury car. Before men fought for crowns of gold, they fought for blades of glass. The prize was different, but the greed was the same. This system created the first forms of social inequality. Those who controlled the resource and the trade routes grew powerful, while those who were cut off struggled. This struggle over obsidian, which played out for tens of thousands of years, is the deep history behind all subsequent human conflict. It is the primal story of our species' relationship with scarce resources. It shows that our economic and political behavior, our drive to control, to trade, to compete, to form alliances, to go to war over things we need or desire, is not a recent invention of civilization. It is a fundamental part of who we are, a pattern of behavior that was established when our most valuable possession was a sharp piece of stone. The obsidian trade was the first pulse of a global economy, a network of desire and violence written in stone. From these deep roots, from the stargazers of the Sahara, the kings of the Nile, the ironsmiths of the forest, and the masters of the desert, a complex tapestry was woven. These empires fell, their cities were buried, their names were forgotten. So why do they matter? Because they never truly left. Their legacy is written in our blood, in our technologies, and in the warnings they carved into stone and sand. Why did we forget them? Why did these vast, innovative, and powerful civilizations vanish from our collective memory, leaving pharaonic Egypt to stand alone in the popular imagination as the sole birthplace of African greatness? The answer is a conspiracy of forces, a perfect storm of climate, conquest, and cultural chauvinism. The first culprit was the planet itself. The catastrophic drying of the Sahara that destroyed the civilization of Nubia Playa also sealed away countless other settlements, burying them under a protective blanket of sand, hiding them from history. The slow exhaustion of the Garamantes water supply erased their kingdom as surely as any invading army. Nature was the first and most effective censor of Africa's deep history. Then came the conquerors. The rising power of Egypt deliberately erased its Nubian rival Tasseti, and later shattered the empire of Kerma, building its own temples on their ruins. History, as always, was written by the victors, who had little interest in preserving the memory of those they had vanquished. Later, the expansion of Rome, and then the spread of Islam, brought new languages, new religions, and new historical narratives that often superseded or ignored the older, indigenous traditions of the lands they transformed. The final act of forgetting came much more recently. For centuries, European and American scholarship was colored by the pervasive biases of colonialism and racism. The prevailing narrative was one of a dark continent, without history or civilization, a people who had contributed nothing to the story of humanity. The great achievements of African antiquity were ignored, dismissed as impossible, or wrongly attributed to outside influence from lighter-skinned peoples. The idea that great cities of stone in Mauritania or a homegrown iron revolution in Nigeria could have been the work of black Africans was, for a long time, simply unthinkable to the Western academic establishment. But today, the great forgetting is coming to an end. A revolution is underway, driven by new technologies and a new generation of scholars, many of them African, who are determined to reclaim their past. Satellite imagery peers through the sands of the Sahara, revealing the outlines of lost Garamantian towns and the settlements of Tichit Walata. Genetic science allows us to trace the ancient migrations that spread the knowledge of ironworking across the continent. Advanced archaeological techniques are unearthing the true complexity and sophistication of these forgotten worlds. We can now see the connections, the intricate web of cause and effect that shaped our world. The refugees from the dying Sahara did not just bring people to the Nile, they brought the very idea of a large-scale, organized state, planting the seeds that would grow into the civilization of the pharaohs. The Nubian blood of conquered Kerma flowed in the veins of the Egyptian empire, its soldiers often forming the backbone of the pharaonic armies. The iron technology of the Nok people armed the great Bantu migrations, reshaping the linguistic and cultural map of half a continent. The trade routes carved out by the Garamantes and the kings of DMT became the arteries for later empires, pathways for the movement of goods, ideas, and armies that are still in use today. These stories are not relics of a dead past. They are urgent messages for the present. They speak of the catastrophic consequences of climate change, of the dangers of unsustainable resource consumption, of the endless, bloody cycle of conflict over land and power. They are a mirror reflecting our own time, showing us civilizations that faced existential threats and, ultimately, failed to overcome them. We are just one link in an endless chain, and the comforting notion of our own permanence is an illusion. Modern archaeologists and climatologists are in a desperate race against time. They are trying to decipher these warnings to save the last traces of these lost worlds from modern wars, from looting, and from the accelerating pace of climate change that threatens to destroy what little remains. They are piecing together the memory of worlds that were brought down by the same forces that threaten us now, a hostile climate and humanity's own self-destructive nature. The question is, are we listening? These ancient peoples left us a library of lessons written in bone and stone. Tell us what you believe is the more enduring lesson from their fall. Is it a warning about the awesome power of nature, a force we can never truly conquer? Or is it a lesson about the insatiable hunger of human ambition, a force we refuse to control? Your answer in the comments is more than an opinion. It's a vote on which ghost of the past you think haunts our future most.